Okay, good morning. We're going to continue with our topic on Middle English. However, we're going to be reading right now a story that is not part of Middle English. Today's story is The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. And the reason why I'm bringing you this story is because it talks about a plague. Okay? And since we're talking about Middle English and Chaucer and Giovanni Boccaccio and the plague of Florence, Italy, I wanted to bring this story because in this story you're going to have people that are going to be in quarantine. Okay? So you guys can get a setup on what we're talking on the topic of quarantine and plagues and all of that. Okay? So let's begin with The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Go ahead.
The Red Death had long been fading in the country. No sickness had ever been so deadly, so great a killer, or so fearful to see. Blood was its mark, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and a sudden feeling that the mind was rushing in circles inside the head. Then there was bleeding through the skin, though it was not cut or broken, and then death. The bright red spots upon the body, and especially upon the face of the sick man, made other men turn away from him, afraid to try to help. And the sickness lasted from the beginning to the end, no more than half an hour.
Very important, I need you to write 3 phases of a plague. 3 phases of plagues. Number 1. Number 1 is endemic. Endemic. And now I'm going to tell you what it means. Endemic is when we have a disease or a virus in a certain area. For example, right here in a school, we have an XY virus and everyone is getting sick. That's endemic. It could go as far as the whole town of Caguas, and it could go even to San Juan, Mayagüez, but it's going to stay here in Puerto Rico, inside our island. That's endemic. Now, number 2, phase number 2, epidemic. Epidemic. An epidemic is when this sickness, this plague, or whatever it can be called, it's starting to spread. So, for example, if you have it in our island and someone gets on a plane and goes to New York, you could leave that over there in New York. So people in New York are going to get sick. So it's starting to spread out to other regions. You get on a cruise and you go to these islands of the Caribbean and you leave it there, starting to spread out throughout the Caribbean. That's epidemic. Remember when we have the H1N1, H1N1, remember that? That it starts spreading up and it got to the United States and it was starting to spread. That was called an epidemic. However, we have our 3rd phase, and that's pandemic. And pandemic is when this plague, disease, or sickness starts to get, or not starts, gets out of proportions and is spread worldwide. When we get to pandemic, that means, we're in trouble. Because it's worldwide. Any place you go, you're going to have it. And that was an example at one point of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was an infection of the lungs in which if you got sick, it was throughout the air by either someone coughing, sneezing, or talking to you. You could get infected. And that, once you were coughing blood, you were screwed. Okay? And you're going to see it throughout the story that the plague has a lot with red. Okay? And tuberculosis could be a major influence for Edgar Allan Poe. By the way, mother of Poe, father of Poe, brother of Poe, wife of Poe, all of them died from tuberculosis. So that's why you see a pattern in Poe's stories, okay? 3 phases: endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. Go ahead.
But Prospero, the ruler of that land, was happy and strong and wise. When half the people of his land had died, he called to him 1,000 healthy, happy friends, and with them went far away to live in one of his palaces.
So the guy is gonna get 1,000 of his friends, and they're gonna be all together inside his palace.
This was a large and beautiful stone building he had planned himself. A strong, high wall circled it. This wall had gates of iron. The gentlemen, after they had entered, brought fire to heat the iron of the gates to make them close so firmly that nobody could open them.
What's gonna happen to the gates? They're locked. No one will be able to open them. So they are gonna be, those 1,000 friends and Prospero are gonna be in quarantine inside this palace. Why? Because the Red Death, the plague, it's outside killing people. Wow, we have a guy showing a lot of pathos, ethos, and logos. Wow, big time. He doesn't show nothing of those because this guy is a selfish and coward leader. Go ahead.
Here, they could forget the sickness, the Red Death. They would leave the outside world to care for itself. Prospero had supplied everything they needed for pleasure. There was music, there was dancing, there was beauty, there was food to eat, and wine to drink. All these were within the wall, and within the wall they would be safe. Outside the wall walked the Red Death. It was near the end of their 5th month there that Prospero asked his friends all to come together for a dancing party, a masquerade. Everyone was asked to come dressed in fine clothes, and with his eyes, or perhaps his whole face, covered by a cloth mask.
5 months inside the palace, and now all of a sudden, well, let's have fun. Well, I'm gonna throw a masquerade so we can dance and have fun.
It was a scene of great richness, that masquerade. There were 7 rooms in which Prospero's friends danced. In many old palaces, the doors can be opened in such a way that rooms like these 7 can be seen all at the same time. In this palace, it was different. Little more than one of them could be seen at one time. There was a turn every 20 or 30 yards. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, was a tall pointed window. The windows were of colored glass and of the same color that was used in each room. The first room had blue cloth hanging on the walls.
First room, blue.
And blue were its windows. The second room had wall hangings of that blue red known as purple, and here the windows were purple. The third was green, so was the glass of the windows. The fourth had hangings and windows of yellow, the fifth of white, the sixth of violet. But the 7th room had hanging on the walls made of a rich, soft cloth which was black, black as night, and the floor, too, was covered with the same heavy black cloth. In this room, the color of the windows was not the same. It was red, a deep blood color. All the rooms were lighted through the outside windows.
So what happened? This last room, very creepy room, all black, but the windows were red, representing blood.
The resulting light was strange indeed, as it colored the shapes of the dancers. But the light that fell on the black hangings through the blood-colored glass was the most fearful of them all. It produced so wild a look on the faces of those who entered that there were few of the dancers who dared to step within those dark walls. In this room
So what happened with that room? Like they don't want to go inside that room.
In this room stood a great clock of black wood.
Very important, that clock. Very important clock. They have symbolisms in that clock.
Gently, it marked the seconds as they passed, and when it was time to mark the hour, the clock spoke with a loud and clear voice. A deep tone as beautiful as music, but so strange that the music and the dancing stopped and the dancers stood still to listen. And then, after another 60 minutes, after another 3,600 seconds of time, of flying time, the clock struck again, and the dancers stopped as before.
So every time the clock strike an hour, boom, everyone like stopped, creeped out in fear.
Nevertheless, it was a happy and beautiful masquerade, and you may be sure that the clothes the dancers chose to wear, their costumes, were strange and wonderful. The dancers looked like the forms we might see in troubled dreams, and these, the dreams, danced softly through the rooms, taking the color of the rooms as they moved. It did not seem that their steps followed the music, but that the music rose from their steps. But into the seventh room the dancers do not go, for the red light coming through the windows and the blackness of the walls hanging make them afraid. And he who enters hears more dimly the striking of the great black clock. But the other rooms are crowded, and in them beats hotly the heart of life. And the dance goes on until at last the clock begins to strike 12.
Why do you think in that seventh and last room they could listen to the clock clearer and louder? What do you think the clock is representing? Time they have left. Time is ticking away. Time for what is ticking away? Oh, we'll know later. Go ahead.
But the other strike. Again the music stopped. Again the dancers stood without moving while the slow striking sound continued. Before the clock was quiet again, many in the crowd saw that in the first room, the blue room, there was a masquerader who had not been seen before.
Hey, they've been there for 5 months. When you're together for 5 months, you already know who is who. However, this new guy that appears, it's someone that is like, well, this guy, we didn't invite this guy. And the problem is how this guy got in if the gates are locked.
As they talked softly to each other about him, a feeling of surprise spread through all the dancers, then a feeling of fear and of sickening horror.
Concern, fear is reigning among this people.
In such a group as this, only a very strange masquerader could have caused such a feeling. Even among those who laugh at both life and death, some matters could not be laughed at. Everyone seemed now deeply to feel that the stranger should not have been allowed to come among them dressed in such clothes. He was tall and very thin, and covered from head to foot like a dead man, prepared for the grave. The mask which covered his face, or was it really a mask? The mask which covered his face was so much like the face of a dead man that the nearest eye could not see the difference. And yet, all this might have been acceptable. But the masquerader, whom nobody knew, had made himself look like the Red Death itself. His clothes were spotted with blood, and the mask over his face was covered with the terrible red spots. Or perhaps it was indeed his face.
So clothing and face cover blood. Go ahead.
When Prospero looked upon this fearful from he was first filled with terror, and then with anger. "Who dares?" he cried. "Take him, seize him, pull off his mask so that we may know who we must hang at sunrise."
So the orders of Prospero is
To kill him.
get this guy because we're gonna know who unmasked the guy so we can see the identity of the guy that we're gonna hang.
Prospero stood in the blue room when he spoke these words. They sounded through the 7 rooms loud and clear. At first, as he spoke, some of the dancers started to rush toward the strange masquerader, but they stopped, afraid, and no one dared to put out a hand to touch him. the stranger started to walk towards the second room. He passed within a feet of Prospero, who stood still surprised. And while the dancers moved back from the center of the room, the stranger moved quietly, without being stopped, without a slow and measured step, through the blue room to the purple room, through the purple room to the green room, through the green room to the yellow, through this to the white, and then to the violet room. As the stranger was entering the seventh room, Prospero suddenly and angrily rushed through the 6 rooms. No one dared to follow him. He held a sharp knife high over his head, ready to strike the stranger. When he was within 3 or 4 feet of the strange masquerader, the stranger turned and stood silent, looking firmly into Prospero's eyes. There was a cry, and the knife dropped, shining upon the black floor, upon which a minute later Prospero himself fell dead. The dancers then rushed into the black room.
Black room. Which one is that one? The 7th, the last one.
The strongest of the men tried to hold the masquerader, whose tall form stood beside the black clock. But when they put their hands on him, they found inside the gray clothes no human form, no body, nothing. Now they knew that it was the Red Death itself that had come in the night. One by one the dancers fell, and each died as he fell.
Ironically, they died in which room? The last one, the black one. Go ahead.
And the fires died, and the clocks stopped, and the darkness and decay, and the Red Death ruled forever over all.
So even though they went into quarantine, they could not escape the Red Death. Prospero tried to defy death, try to kill the Red Death, the masked guy, couldn't, because indeed was the plague. So if your destiny is about to die, there's no way to run. Death is going to go after you. Plain simple, okay? Our guy is a selfish king, coward king, because he left his people outside dying while he was inside his palace with his friends, without thinking that his people were outside dying, suffering of the Red Death, and eventually Red Death strike his friends and indeed Prince Prospero. So basically that will be it on Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death. Thank you.